9 waves have crashed upon the shore. 9 waves have crashed, and 9 waves more since the days of which I speak. Days when Finn McCall, druid, huntsman, warrior, leader of the Fina, the warrior band that protected the shores of ancient Ireland, was enjoying the summer, sitting out upon the great hill of Alma, watching the world go past, when word was brought to him by a messenger that pirate ships were stationed off the shore of the White Strand, the beach known as Ventray. And so at once Finn McCall summoned his men and his loyal women to him, and they raced across the land, raced down to that beach, and even as they crested the edge of the beach, they saw out to sea a huge, vast fleet of ships, a fleet like a forest of masts, covering the ocean wave in every direction they could see. Greater than anything they had ever possibly imagined before, and the largest of all of these ships, far larger than any ship ever seen off the coast of Ireland before, flew the flag which Finn McCall alone recognised, for he had heard tell of its design in the stories of travellers from far-off lands. This he recognised as the standard of the King of the World, that most notorious of men, who had subjugated land after land after land to his might, to his empire, to his ego, controlling bigger and bigger and bigger territories, never satisfied until he conquered the entire world, as indeed he believed he had, and that was why he called himself King of the World. But it seemed to Finn McCall that he had left one vital part of the world untouched, and Finn thanked the gods that he had done so, for Ireland had never received a visit from this most august of worldly leaders, till now. A messenger came from that greatest of ships, a messenger bearing a demand that Finn McCall, on behalf of all of the people of Ireland, should bend his knee and accept the authority and leadership of the King of the World, that this last territory should be added to the king's domain, so that his title truly meant precisely what it claimed to mean. Well, Finn McCall had no need to go and consult with the other men and women of Ireland, for he knew that whatever they might think and they might feel, he himself, he would never bend his knee to anyone, least of all some foreign potentate drunk on delusions of his own power. And so he sent the messenger back with no uncertain message to deliver to the King of the World. And as soon as that messenger arrived back at the head of the fleet, a great swarm of ships emerged and came to shore, each of them weighed down with fully armed warriors. Wave after wave after wave of blood and death descended upon the land of Ireland. Day after day after day, Finn McCall and the Fina battled to keep the forces of the King of the World at bay, until eventually the White Strand became known as the Red Strand. So deep and thick was it in the blood of the dead and the dying. And there are those who said it should have been called the Black Strand for the dense cloud of flies that feasted upon the blood, and the dense crowd of ravens that feasted upon the flies and the flesh of the dying, let alone the wolves who howled from the mountains thereabout and descended to feast as best they could. And it became clear to Finn, to his men, to his loyal folk, that brave and courageous as they were vastly outnumbered by the King of the World and his enormous armies, who could send men after men after men to their certain death. And it seemed only a matter of days before finally Ireland would succumb. And having exhausted all of his mortal resources, Finn McCall at length turned to the ancient gods. And that night, as the moon cast its glow upon the ocean wave, Finn McCall knelt and prayed to the old ones, to the ancient ones. And it was the lord of the ocean wave himself, Mananaun Maclear, who answered. For a storm blew up that very night, a great tidal wave of ocean water crashing and smashing hither and yon, as the winds whipped and the rains fell and the lightning flashed and the thunder ripped, and ship after ship after ship in the fleet of the King of the World sank to the bottom of the ocean, there to be feasted upon by the fish of Ireland. 3 days and 3 nights the storm raged, until the fleet of the King of the World was reduced by 2/3. And the third that did survive was so ill from the tossing and the turning of the ocean wave that when they finally came ashore at the end of this terrible, terrible storm, they were greatly weakened. And so finally the tide itself began to turn in favour of the Fina, in favour of Finn McCool. And at length even the King of the World, safe on his great ship, watching all that befell the men that he sent to die in search of his fame, his own glory, even he saw that his claims to be King of the World could no longer be held to be true. And so he did the one thing that he had not done in a very, very long time. He took to a ship and went to shore. The boat moored. The King of the World came upon Ireland for the very first time, his foot upon the dark red sand. Armed to the teeth, fully armoured, shield, sword, spear, daggers, axes to the ready carried by his servants, he launched himself into battle, hacking and slashing until finally his eyes clapped upon Finn McCool himself, and King recognised King, and the 2 men fell to fighting. They hacked and they ripped and they tore it, they slashed at each other, ducking and diving beneath the blows of each other's weapons, until sword broke, till spear shattered, till dagger fell deep in the red mire of the sand. Weapon after weapon discarded, the men hacking and tearing, their own blood pouring from their wounds, both of them exhausted, and finally, as the day drew to a close, Finn McCool, with a sudden flash of his blade, took the head of the King of the World, and it bounced across the sands of Ventray. When his men saw the King of the World was king no more, they turned tail and fled back to their ships. The Empire had fallen. The Emperor was gone. As was the way of things in that day and age, the Fina set to honouring their own dead, to finding the bits of the bodies scattered about the beach, to ensuring they had decent burial in the custom of ancient days, and putting aside the bodies of their fallen enemies, that their surviving kin might come in their turn to collect their dead and dispose of them in whatever way was appropriate to the worlds from which they came. And so in due course, when message was received that the bodies were ready to collect, the soldiers, injured and battered, came from the surviving ships of what had once been the fleet of the King of the World to collect their own fallen dead, and with them came a young woman, beautiful and graceful and gentle, and utterly horrified by all of the terrible carnage that she was seeing about her. For while she had accompanied her father, the King of the World, on many of their adventures, he had always ensured she was kept at a very safe distance, that she should not be sullied by the reality of battle. And here, for the first time, there were limbs severed, heads severed, entrails splattered about the beach. The reality of war and death confronted her, the very source of her royalty, her power, her wealth, her father's empire. And there, laid out, ready for collection, was the battered, cut-about, headless corpse of her father, the head propped a few inches away from the severed neck. And whilst her servants, her bodyguard, tried to keep her back, she pushed them aside and rushed to the corpse of her dead sire, her dead father. Cradling him in her arms, she wept and she wept and she wept. For whilst he may have been a tyrant to all and sundry about the world, to her he was just her father, and she mourned him as any good daughter would. And whilst it may seem to us in this day and age a bloodthirsty and gory thing to do, she picked up the severed head of her father and kissed him goodbye. Perhaps it was the taste of her father's blood still fresh upon his skin. Perhaps it was the buzzing of all of the wasps and the flies and the insects feasting upon the corpses of the beach. Perhaps it was the distant howling of the wolves in the mountains, hungry for more flesh. Perhaps it was the croaking of the crows pecking at the unclaimed bodies. Whatever it was, sight or sound or stench, in that instant, Mis, daughter of the king of the world, lost not only her father but her sanity. It was gone from her. She ripped and she tore at her clothing. She scratched at her face. She yanked out her hair in clumps. She screamed, she howled, she beat her chest, and she fled from her servants, from the Fina who tried to stop her and rescue her and bring her back. She fled and she fled and she fled from the sight of so much death up into the mountains. And as much as the men tried to find her and bring her back, she had gone. Day after day they searched, until finally the warriors that had once been in the service of the king of the world had to admit that she was as lost as the emperor, and they turned their ships round and went back from whence they had come, never to be seen in Ireland again. And Finn McCall, in his turn, had to admit that his warriors could not find this lost girl, that perhaps she lay dead in some ravine up in the mountain. And they went back to their camp on the other side of Ireland. And the local chieftain, he searched and had his men search for a while, but they too gave up and assumed, as everybody else assumed, that Mis was dead. And in some senses, Mis was dead. Part of her was dead. The bit that had been Mis was no more. Reports came back to that local chieftain of a strange figure seen stalking the mountainsides, howling and snarling and slavering, something neither quite human nor quite beast, but a mixture of the two. And those few people who got close enough to see her, and it was undoubtedly a her, reported that she was covered in great bushy fur, grey and hairy and dragging upon the ground, that she had the most enormous claws and talons upon her feet, that her face stretched out in a muzzle with great fangs, and that she was hungry for raw meat. Shepherds reported their sheep attacked, found the remains of them the next day. Travellers sometimes never arrived at their ultimate destination. Other times they would arrive reporting having been chased through the mountainside by some slavering, half-human, half-animal creature, a werewolf. The chieftain realised that perhaps this strange creature was actually the missing woman. And again he tried to send warriors, he sent druids, he sent all manner of people to try and find this lost lady. But none of them ever succeeded, and half of them never even came back. Month rolled into year rolled into decade, and decade into centuries. The king died to be replaced by other kings who in their turn died and were replaced by other kings, and the myth and the stories and the legends told of the Werewolf of Sliabh Mis, for the mountain by then had become named after the strange wild woman who lived in it, became fixtures of the storytellers for miles and miles around. And still, sheep were attacked, horses were attacked, travellers were attacked. Still people tried to find this strange creature, to tackle it, to defeat it. If it were a woman, to rescue it. None succeeded. Chieftain after chieftain offered reward of gold and silver to anyone brave enough to take on the task, but as more and more people died and disappeared, fewer and fewer came forward to take up the task. 300 years passed. And at great length, at the end of that 300 years, a young man came to the court of the then chieftain. A young man called Dubh Ruis. Dubh Ruis presented himself to the chieftain. And he said, "I hear there is gold and silver to be had for anyone who captures the she-wolf of the mountains." And the chieftain admitted this was the case. But the chieftain looked him up and down and he said, "You are very small for a warrior." "I am no warrior," said the young man. "You are very young for a druid." "I am no druid," said the youth. "Then what are you that you should come seeking adventure in this way?" "I am a poet," said the young man, and the courtroom fell about laughing. A poet who will go and tackle this dangerous savage beast of the mountains who has slaughtered so many in century after century after century. I am a poet. I am a singer. I am a teller of tales. I am a weaver of songs. And yes, I come in search of adventure. Well, the chieftain said, "Young man, if your life is worth so little to you, well, what can I do to stop you? Go up the mountain if you wish to go up the mountain. And if you come back alive, I will give you a quarter of the reward. Because I do not expect you to come back with the wild woman of the mountains. In fact, I do not really expect you to come back at all," said the chieftain. But Dubh Ruis would have none of it, and off he went. He journeyed on the back of his pony up the foothills of the mountain, up Sliabh Mis, higher and higher and higher, until it became too rocky to progress any further with the horse, and so he tied the unfortunate beast to a tree, patted her on the head and reassured her that she would be safe. And he took his harp, and he took what little coins he had upon his person, and he went further and further up the mountain on foot, until by noon the sun was beating down, and he came to a plateau, a great flat stone halfway up the mountain, and there he stopped, puffing and gasping from the exertion. And he took off his cloak and unfolded it and laid it out, smooth, upon the great rock. And in one corner of this rock he placed his harp. And he took from his pouch, from his belt, 2 bags of coins, silver coins and gold coins. In the second corner of the cloak he weighed it down with a small bag of silver coins, and the third corner a small bag of gold coins. Then he took off his tunic and laid it to one side. He took off his shoes and laid them to one side. He took off his trousers and laid them to one side. He took off his breechclout and laid that to one side, and stood there as naked as the day he was born, and placed himself in the final corner of the cloak. And all of the while he was doing this, out of the corner of his eye he could see movement up the side of the mountain. He could hear with his musician's ear a low growling and snarling, getting gradually closer, and a little louder and a little louder and a little louder, as piece by piece by piece he prepared himself for what was to come. When everything was done and ready, he sat naked in one corner of his cloak, and he reached out and he took his harp and placed it between his legs, and he began to pluck upon his wood, stroking it, caressing it, making it vibrate with song. And he played melody after melody after melody. Some of them were beautiful, gentle, romantic melodies. Some of them were sorrowful, sad, unhappy tales, accompanied by his beautiful melodic voice. Some of them were bawdy, fit only for the lowest of taverns. Some of them were classical accounts of gods and ancestors and great adventures and daring do by the old heroes, fit for a royal court. And all of the while he was playing song after song after song upon his harp. The growling stopped, but the movement from the corner of his eye came closer and closer and closer and closer, until a shadow fell upon him as he was playing, and he played to the end of that particular song. and stopped. He looked at the source of the shadow, and she was as monstrous as all of the travellers had ever described, and then some. Covered in fur, a great muzzle jutting fangs, great pointed ears, everything short of a tail. She was more wolf than woman. And as the music died in its echo, she began to snarl, and saliva began to drip down upon the cloak on the rock. "Lady," said the musician, "would you like me to play further?" And she stared at him for a while, and he repeated the question. And something from deep within her throat croaked. Not words exactly, but something that maybe was a memory of words. Words so long unspoken that they had shriveled and dried in her throat. But she nodded. And so he began to play more. And play and play and play. And every so often he would stop and wait until she started to snarl again. And he would repeat the question, and she would croak again. And he noticed with each repetition, with each croaking, that guttural sound became more word-like, more intelligible, until finally, as the evening grew mellow, she formed her first word, the first word she had spoken in 300 years. And she said yes. Yes. Yes! And he played a beautiful romantic melody. And then he placed his harp down. And he said to her, "Do you know what this is?" And again she tried to work her words, and it took a lot of coughing and spluttering and snarling, but eventually she said yes again, and then she croaked the word harp. "You will remember harps," said the young man, "from the days when you were the daughter of the king of the world, living in great palaces and royal courts. You would have had musicians playing such instruments for you." And she nodded. And he reached and he picked up one of the bags from the corner of the cloak, and he jingled it. "Do you remember this sound?" he asked her. And again she said, "Yes." And he emptied the pouch, and the silver coins fell out. He said, "You will remember these silver coins from the days when you were the daughter of the king of the world. You would have seen huge quantities of coins." And he repeated it with the sack of gold and emptied that out. And she said, "Yes, I remember those." A whole sentence. "This I remember," she said, pointing to silver. "This I remember," she said, pointing to gold. "This I remember," pointing to the harp. "But what's that?" And she pointed to him. "That, my lady," said the musician, "is my tricking rod, my magic staff. Would you like to see how it works?" And she nodded eagerly, for she did not remember such things from her days as a princess. And so he showed her, and she enjoyed it so much she asked him to show her again, and he did. And then he showed her a third time, and she begged him to show it a fourth. But he said, "This may be a myth, my lady, but I am still human nonetheless. And a fourth time is too much. I need to get my breath, to drink, to eat, to recover." And at once he set about unpacking the bag he had brought with some provisions in it. And whilst he was unpacking his bread and his cheese, she was off up the mountainside and back within a matter of minutes, carrying a dead deer upon her shoulder. And she flopped it down in front of him, ripped off a leg and presented it to him to eat. Thank you, he said. But, my lady, do you remember cooking? And she looked at him, confusedly. For being a princess, she had never in her life been in a kitchen. That's what servants are for. Let me show you, he said. You won't remember how this is done, but then you probably never saw it being done in the first place. He took his knife and he began to dig out a trench. A great trench in the soil besides the great flat rock on which they were sitting. And once he had dug it out and patted it smooth, he took his drinking cup and went to the nearby stream and filled it with water and brought it back again and again and again and again until the trough was filled with water. Then he started a small fire, and as the fire began to build, he placed stones upon the fire. And when those stones grew hot, using the empty cup and his knife, he would gently scoop them up and carry the stones across to the water trough and drop them in, and the water got hotter and hotter and hotter. And when the water was warm enough, he placed that ripped off haunch of venison into the trough, and with more stones and more stones it began to cook and cook and cook, and it tasted and smelt glorious. And they sat, and between them they dined happily on cooked venison. At the end of this, replete with music, with love, with food, with the flask of mead he had brought with him up the mountainside, he said, Lady, I have one last trick to show you. The rod again, she said. No, well, maybe later. This trick involves the trough, and he led her by the hand to the now cooled off water in the trough, and he stood her in the trough. And there he took the great gobbets of fat that had boiled off the meat, and he smeared it up her legs, on her arms, on her back, on her stomach. And he took his knife, and at first she was nervous, but he was gentle, and he had shown her such kindness. He began to scrape off the fat from that ancient sacred deer known as Imak, until the fur came away and the skin was revealed underneath. For an entire lunar phase they lived, the two of them, up in Sliabh Mis, each day much like the day before. Half the day spent playing music, telling stories, singing songs. At first she would just croon and rock, but eventually she began to learn the words and recite them, and eventually towards the end of that lunar month she even remembered the words to songs which he himself did not know, songs from 300 years ago. So she began to teach him. And each day they would feast on venison or goat or sheep. And each evening she would stand in the trough and he would smear her with fat and scrape off a little more and a little more and a little more, until as the lunar passage passed, not only did she become more hairless, but her muzzle began to recede until it was like a human face again. Her huge great wolf ears shrank back into her head. Her claws and her talons began to retract into her fingers and into her toes, and by the end of the moon she was indistinguishable from any ordinary, beautiful, well-born lady. But the one thing, because he was a musician, that he had not thought to bring with him was clothing for her. And so when the time came to return to the land of civilization, he took off his tunic and gave it to her to put on. He took off his cloak and wrapped it around her to put on. And she, riding on the back of the horse, which he had obviously been feeding all of this time during the month, they rode down. He, topless and cloakless, but trousered, back to the court of the Len chieftain. And as soon as the chieftain and all of his advisors and nobles saw this beautiful, strangely dressed woman in the company of this young man whom they had assumed was long since dead, they at once realised that this must be Mis, the werewolf of the mountain. They were amazed. She was returned to normality. They showered the couple with gifts, with land, Mis had fallen in love with Dubh Ruis. Dubh Ruis had fallen in love with Mis. They were married and they lived happily for many a long year until the day when the poet died. But that is another story and the end of this one. Thank you.